Andrew Motion's From the Journal of a Disappointed Man is a poem that stands out to me in the collection as being somewhat different. Because if you think about it, most of the other poems in the collection are about the relationships between people. And this poem is very, what I would call, egocentric. It focuses very much on the poetic voices, musing, thinking about themselves and where they are in their life. And the title of the poem is an intertextual reference. It refers to another minor literary classic by a writer called Bernard Cummings, who died aged 30 of multiple sclerosis. And he knew he was dying when he wrote his journal of a disappointed man. And the book has become a euphemism for what it means to have your life cut short. And I think there's a kind of irony there with R from the Journal of a Disappointed Man, because to me, the poetic voice reads very much as an older man who is reflecting on his experience of life. He hasn't had his life cut short in a literal sense, but in a figurative sense, he's wondering if he's wasted some of his life, or what his life has come to. Now, from the Journal of a Disappointed Man, the word journal, I think, is significant. A journal is meant to be a daily record of everything that you do and what you're thinking and your opinions, but it's different from a diary in that a diary is meant to be just something that you keep privately. I know some diaries of famous people get published, but a journal is something that you write for publication. So from the outset, the poetic voice has almost an egotism to his voice in that he's expecting people to hear this. Now, in terms of structure, you've got 11 quatrains, which are in free verse, although they do have a regular line length. And if I just tell you the basic story of the poem, you can see how that structure fits, because the poetic voice is a man who comes across a group of workmen who are trying to swing a huge wooden column from one place to another. And in the end, they aren't able to do it and give up and let it drop into the water. And he doesn't understand these men's manual labour at all. He makes a lot of noise about telling us he doesn't understand the kind of work that they do, and he's watching them as if they're another species almost. So you've got the sense of regularity between the stanzas and the fact that they're all quatrains, the regular work. But you've also got this sense of discord in the fact that it's free verse. You've got this sense that he doesn't follow a regular pattern. He doesn't understand what they're doing. So there's a kind of following something but then breaking out of it. I would say that the poem is possibly about masculinity and what it means to be a man, because he's a very different kind of man from the men that he's watching, and that means it could also be about class to an extent. But I think it's an existentialist work. Let me just write that out for you. Now, existentialism is a school of philosophy that suggests that there is nothing other than the moment we are in now. You know, there's no afterlife, there's no meaning to life, we simply exist. So he's talking about how everything that we do, no matter how hard we try, can turn out to be futile. So let's have a look into the poem itself. You'll notice that there are some, but like many of our poems of the decade, there's a lack of poetic features, particularly when he's repeating what the workmen say. And he's viewing them from a different viewpoint, almost as if he's watching them like they're specimens in a petri dish. So we begin with, I discovered these men. So the verb discovered there, I think, supports what I've just said, in that he almost sees himself as an explorer, kind of discovering a new species. So he sees these men as very different to himself. I discovered these men. And that's quite a colloquial way of saying, he doesn't say I came across a group of men, does he? He says, I discovered these men. And that, again, shows his sense of not really sorry, I spelled that wrong, colloquial. I thought that didn't look right. It sums up his sense of not really understanding what he's seeing. And that carries on here. There was all the paraphernalia of chains, pulleys, cranes, ropes. So we've got this kind of list, and it's in this lexis of construction, which is alien to him. But you can see he's taking almost a pleasure in kind of listing all of these things in this asyndetic list. It's asyndetic because it's not split by conjunctions, and that really adds a sense of pace, I think, when the list is just set by commas. So he's rushing through, which gives this tone of enthusiasm to listing the builders. He reminds me of when my sons were little and they loved pretending to be builders and having all the stuff. And this word paraphernalia, which just means a large pile of things, shows that he doesn't really understand what the things are. He's just got a fascination with them. So the other thing I suppose that you could say, if they are trying to shift a new pile into the pier, and he talks about the wooden pile. So if you imagine a huge, like a column, like perhaps a telegraph pole, but much bigger, a massive affair swinging over the water. And notice the enjambment here really emphasises the enormity of the task. It doesn't fit into one stanza. So picture the huge column that they're trying to fit in. You could argue, couldn't you, that this shows a sense of masculinity, because that column could be said to be a phallic symbol. He's literally standing watching all these men swinging about this massive, pole. And he's fascinated by this, but also completely puzzled by it. He calls it a massive affair, which is really vague. He doesn't really know what to call it, and all the way through, he doesn't know what to say. Everything else was in the massive style as well, even the men, very powerful men, very ruminative and silent men. So you've got the repetition here of the word men to emphasise that what he's seeing makes him think about the nature of masculinity. And there's almost an obsessive quality to the poem. I think that comes out in the title, the idea that I'm going to write something that's about me and one day people might want to pay for it. But there's also an obsessive quality to the way that he's watching the other men. And he carries on talking about them with detachment, as if they are a different species to him. Speech was not something to interest them. Now notice the interesting syntax there, because the order of the words, the syntax of the sentence, is quite unusual. It would be more natural to say, well, they were not interested in speech. But he's chosen to put the word speech first, I think, to emphasise his importance, because he's a poet. And so therefore that emphasises the difference between the physical job of the construction workers and his own work, which is working with words. So it emphasises the difference between the poet and the manual labourer. And this is one of the things that's fascinating him. And what he's doing, of course, is thinking about, can you be manly if you're a poet? Can you be intelligent if you do physical manual labour? He talks about how he doesn't really understand what they're doing. To him, they are making obscure movements. And if they talked at all, it was like this: let go, hold tight, or monosyllables. So to him, the way that they speak and the way that they move, these construction workers, is really alien. But he exaggerates here, or emphasises his own intelligence by saying, I could tell that for all their strength and experience, these men were up against a great difficulty. So he feels that he's almost translated that the poet is intelligent. And then we get an end stop here. They're up a great difficulty, end stop, I cannot say what. So there's a sense of kind of defeat here, which mirrors the physical defeat that the men are about to suffer. So he repeats the word men, and then all of a sudden he calls them monsters who are silent on the subject. So first of all, we've got this metaphor here the men are like monsters. I don't think he finds them scary. Perhaps he's a bit intimidated by their physical stature, because he talks about that a lot, doesn't it? All their strength, massive men, silent, powerful men. But to him they are monstrous because they are unnatural. You know, they don't talk, they're physically huge, and they're doing something that he doesn't understand. Baffled, I thought at first, but then I realised indifferent, which means you don't care anymore, and tired, so tired of the whole business. So here we get that sense of existentialism, in that they are worn down by their daily task, their life's work, and that gives some common ground with the poet, doesn't it? In that he is a disappointed man. You know, his life has disappointed him too. And in fact, Andrew Motion became poet laureate before writing this poem, and he said that he felt that being made laureate ruined his work. So he was quite literally disappointed in life, even though he still lives, and didn't die young. They talk about the man nearest to me still saying nothing, but crossing his strong arms over his chest, showed me that for all he cared, the pile could go on swinging until the crack of doom. Now that means eternity, like the end of time. I think it's almost got a Tolkien kind of feel to it. You know, the idea of a disastrous future. And the man simply doesn't care. But there's a dichotomy here, a kind of push-pull between feeling that the men are wound down, are worn down like him, but also there's a strength in the fact that they don't care. He kind of admires that, because he says that the man still has strong arms and still doesn't say anything. I should say I watched him at least an hour, and again that builds up that sense that he's quite obsessive about watching this all unfold. And the poem takes a slightly different tone here. He calls what they're trying to do a secret problem, which makes it sound almost kind of mystic. And in fact, he calls one of the men trying to fix this a mystic. So there's a sense that there's now almost a spiritual quality to their work, emotions, or the poetic voice's eyes. So he now sees them as more equal to him. He gives their work a mystical or spiritual dimension. No one spoke, no one said what they saw, though one fellow did spit, and with round eyes followed the trajectory of his brown bolus. And so one man spits. A bolus is a rounded, chewed up lump of food or something. In this case, it's tobacco. And people don't really do this anymore, but you know, years ago people used to chew tobacco rather than smoking it. And he spits this into the water rather like an offering, kind of after the pile, which they have now dropped into the water, not caring anymore. So it's almost like he's making a sacrifice to the water or to the pile. So these men have now become almost like priests or acolytes who are priests' assistants. The foreman and most original thinker smoked a cigarette to relieve the tension. I think there's a mocking tone here. How does he know that the foreman is the most original thinker if none of them speak? I feel here that he's almost kind of asserting his own authority, not authority over the men, but he feels that he's better than them. Afterwards, with a kind of majesty. So again, we've got this sense of him being compared here to something of significance, to a king or an emperor. He turned on his heel and walked away. And the poetic voice does admire these men's ability to quit with strength, to say we can't do this and walk away. With this eclipse of interest, the incident was suddenly closed, and you've got this enjambment here, which again emphasises the pace at which this suddenly all stops. That left the pile still in mid-air, and me. Oh, sorry, they don't drop it into the water; they just leave it hanging there because they don't know how to do it. That left the pile still in mid-air, and me, of course. Now, I think this last bit's really interesting. First of all, there's a sense that the men are able to quit what they're doing, the workmen, but he's not. He feels that he has to keep going. And the little "of course" at the end reinforces that egotism, that, of course, in the end, this poem is all about me. He sees himself as a better, perhaps higher class individual than these workmen.